The sun hadn't fully climbed yet, but the heat already clung like wet cloth. Inside the bamboo, fenced POW compound outside Manila, a dozen Japanese women knelt in silence. Dust hung midair, catching the pale gold of early morning. Then a voice sharp, foreign, commanding cut through it like a blade. "Do not pray here." Every head jerked up, boots crunched closer. An American sergeant, sweat streaking down his neck, repeated it. Slower, louder, as if volume could erase faith. The women froze, hands half, folded, lips parted mid, whisper. One of them, a nurse from Nagoya, still had her palms pressed together when the guard's shadow crossed her face. The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was fear hardened into air. You could hear a fly buzzing near the ration barrels, a cough somewhere in the barracks. The command wasn't shouted again. It didn't need to be. The message had landed. No kneeling, no chants, no gods inside these fences. By 1945, more than 4,000 Japanese women, mostly nurses, clerks, and civilians, were scattered across Americon, controlled camps in Southeast Asia. Fewer than 10% had any military rank, yet all wore the same plain khaki cloth stamped PW. The men were treated harshly, the women differently, but not gently. The order to ban prayer came down after a riot weeks earlier. Officers said it was for security, but in practice, it stripped the captives of the only act left that was truly theirs. One interpreter wrote later, "They looked like statues, afraid to move even their breath." From the guard tower, you could see them still kneeling, not in defiance, not exactly, but as if their bodies hadn't caught up to the rule yet. The sun baked the dirt around their knees. The medic on duty wiped his forehead and looked away. Orders were orders. When the women finally stood, no one spoke. They just brushed the dust off their skirts and returned to work detail, heads down, rhythm steady. But that night, under the same moon that silvered the wire fence, one of them dared to whisper the same forbidden prayer, barely a breath, barely sound. And that single whisper would ripple through the camp like a fuse waiting to burn. Night in the camp wasn't silent, it breathed. Mosquitoes whined, the wind scraped through the bamboo walls, and somewhere a tin cup rolled across dirt. In Barrack 12, a single candle stub flickered, barely fighting the dark. A young nurse, Shizuko Mori, 20, cupped her hands around the flame and whispered a Shinto verse she'd learned as a child. The same words that had been banned 12 hours ago, "Do not pray here." The echo still rang in her skull. But whispers were not prayers, not officially. That was her gamble. The air inside the hut was thick with heat and fear. Around her, 10 other women lay asleep or pretending to be. Shizuko's fingers trembled as she set down the rice bowl lid she used as a charm. It wasn't metal, it wasn't sacred, but it was hers. Boots crunched outside, a flashlight beam sliced through the cracks in the bamboo wall. She froze. The guard's shadow lingered, then moved on. Only when his steps faded did her lungs remember how to work again. In the logbooks, infractions like this meant punishment, 3 days with half rations. 1 in 5 prisoners got written up every month, most for things like talking during roll call, or singing unapproved songs. But praying, that wasn't just disobedience. That was defiance with intent. Shizuko knew the risk. The camp's rumor mill said a woman in another barrack had been dragged out for kneeling too long. No one ever saw her again. Whether true or not didn't matter. The story itself was enough to keep everyone quiet. Still, Shizuko whispered, because silence, she thought, was heavier than sin. She wasn't asking for rescue or mercy, just to be heard by something beyond wire and rifles. Across the compound, a sentry paused mid-step, hearing something faint, like wind humming through reeds. He stared at the women's huts, puzzled, then shook his head. Probably the rats, he muttered. Inside, Shizuko closed her eyes and finished the verse. When she opened them, the candle had died. Darkness pressed close again, but her chest felt lighter. The next morning, a new face entered the barrack, a young U.S., medic carrying a tin basin and a bottle of quinine. His expression wasn't cruel, just tired. He looked at the women, then at their silence, and something in his jaw tightened. That medic's name was Ellis, and her whisper would soon haunt him more than malaria ever could. Morning hit the camp like a hammer, bright, brutal, unrelenting. Private Ellis moved through the fever ward with a tin basin in one hand and a cigarette in the other, the smoke fighting the stench of sweat and sulfur soap. He'd been assigned here for 2 weeks, but the smell still turned his stomach every time. He wasn't supposed to talk to the prisoners. Just hand out quinine, count rations, keep his head down. But that morning, when he saw the same woman, small, pale, eyes swollen from fever, something made him pause. She tried to bow slightly, weakly, and he muttered no need. Then he noticed the rice bowl lid lying near her blanket. Its surface was etched with a small, uneven circle finger. Traced over and over, he didn't ask, but he knew what it was. The women barely spoke English, yet Ellis could read their silence like scripture. He'd seen men die screaming for God, but this was different. These prisoners didn't scream, they swallowed faith whole like a secret ration. He moved to the next cot, lifting an arm slick with sweat. The pulse was faint, dehydration, he muttered, scribbling a note. The guard watching him only shrugged. "They'll live," he said flatly. Stat reports later estimated that 65% of prisoners here were infected with malaria at least once. Supplies ran short, medics improvised. Water was boiled in oil drums, gauze cut from old uniforms, but it wasn't infection Ellis feared. It was the hollowness in their eyes. That night he sat at his cot, staring at his hands. They reeked of disinfectant and something worse, complicity. He opened his journal, meaning to write about the fever count, but instead scribbled a single line, "They are more disciplined than the healthy." He thought of the command, "Do not pray here." It echoed louder than gunfire. Orders made sense on paper, avoid unrest, keep order. But out here, where people whispered to stay human, the rules felt poisonous. He closed the journal, but the words burned behind his eyelids. They looked like they wanted to apologize. But orders don't bend, one of his fellow medics had said. Ellis now understood what that meant. Before sleeping, he opened the journal again and wrote a second line. "A strange one, do not pray here because freedom itself prays for us." Those words would soon stop being private. The fan above Ellis's head rattled like an old tank track. Heat made the ink bleed as he reread the sentence he'd scrawled hours earlier. "Do not pray here because freedom itself prays for us." He hadn't meant to write something poetic. It had just slipped out, like confession. Outside, the camp was waking up. Boots thumped, dogs barked, tin bowls clanged against the mess barrels. The women lined up wordlessly, same as every morning, thin, sunburned, their faces unreadable. Ellis watched from the infirmary door, the smell of iodine still in his hands. He thought about tearing the diary page out. If an officer saw it, he'd be done. But something in that line. Its quiet rebellion held him. Maybe, because it said what no one dared, that this command to silence had infected everyone, even the guards. Officially, the no-prayer policy wasn't cruelty. It was protocol. After several prisoner riots across the Pacific camps, HQ had declared all religious gatherings potential catalysts for disorder. On paper it sounded logical. In practice it felt like a racing breath. That afternoon, a corporal came to collect medical reports. He glanced at Ellis's notebook lying half open on the cot. "You writing poetry now, Doc?" he smirked. Ellis snapped it shut, just inventory, but that night the thought kept spinning in his head, freedom praying for the captives. Could it be the other way around? He flipped open his diary again. Beneath the original line, he added a second. "Their silence feels louder than our anthem." Across the yard, floodlights cut pale cones into the dark. The guards patrolled slower now, less shouting, less noise overall. Even the dogs had stopped barking as much. An interpreter once told Ellis, "They are afraid of your silence." He hadn't believed it then. Now, he wondered, if the command itself "Do not pray here." had created a kind of haunted peace neither side understood. The next morning, Ellis overheard the lieutenant talking by the gate. HQ extending the order to all camps, he said. Standard regulation, same wording. Ellis's chest tightened, his words, the ones from his diary, suddenly felt small compared to that machinery of command. Because now, that single phrase would travel farther than any soldier. 3 words carried by radio, repeated by men who never knew what it killed. The radio static cracked like dry leaves across the Pacific network of U.S. command posts, the same phrase repeated in clipped American accents, effective immediately. No religious acts permitted within confinement zones. By dawn, it reached Luzon, then Mindanao. 11 camps, 8,200 prisoners brought under a single line of control. At Camp O'Donnell, a young radio operator scratched the phrase into his logbook, under routine updates. He didn't even pause to think what it meant. Orders were orders. He clicked off the mic, sipped his cold coffee, and lit another cigarette. The room smelled of sweat, metal, and boredom. By the time the message reached the southern camps, officers had already gathered their interpreters. Repeat it exactly. One said, no prayer, no kneeling, no exceptions. Each word was translated with surgical precision. Each syllable landed like a door slamming shut. The Japanese captives didn't resist. They simply went quiet. You could hear that silence move across the compounds like wind, first confusion, then surrender. To the guards, it felt like control. To the prisoners, it felt like a burial. Reports later showed that in the 2 weeks following the order, incidents of defiance dropped 30%. Commanders marked it as success, morale stable, one report claimed, but between the lines the same officer scribbled, eyes duller, less movement at dusk. A command travels faster than compassion. A captured interpreter muttered once, too softly for anyone to catch. Yet it was true, the words had outrun empathy. Every island now spoke the same language of restriction, enforced by men who barely understood why it mattered. One officer, Captain Reeves, had just arrived in Mindanao when the order hit. He'd served in Europe before, seen what blind obedience could do. But he told himself this was different. Discipline, not cruelty. Still, when he walked the perimeter that evening, the quiet unnerved him. No singing, no murmuring, just the sound of flies and the soft clink of metal bowls. He wrote in his notebook, they follow the rule too perfectly. The next day, Reeves met with his sergeant to discuss the new regulations, Campscom. The sergeant said, like a graveyard, Reeves didn't reply. His eyes drifted toward the women's barracks, where someone stood motionless by the fence. For the first time, he wondered what silence really cost. Captain Reeves adjusted his cap, squinting under the brutal Mindanao sun. The air shimmered above the dirt yard, and even the flies seemed tired. Around him, the camp moved like a slow machine guard's pacing, prisoners hauling barrels, no voices raised. On paper, it was perfect order. In his gut, it felt wrong. He kept notes habit from his Europe days. Every morning, he logged incidents, morale levels, and hygiene scores. Since the Do Not Pray order, the numbers looked good. Fewer fights, fewer punishments, but beneath that tidy surface was something colder. The camp's psychologist report hinted at it. Suicidal behavior plus 100% in past fortnight. Reeves underlined that line twice. He stepped outside the admin hut, clipboard in hand. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of water buckets. One woman stumbled, knees scraping dirt, yet no one moved to help her. They all knew the rule. No interaction beyond assigned labor. Reeves clenched his jaw. The logic behind the order was clean. Silence equals stability. HQ didn't want another riot like the one in Baton. But in practice, it was psychological warfare, directed inward. Peace without voice is not peace. A Japanese interpreter muttered when Reeves questioned him earlier. The phrase stuck. He began seeing patterns. The women weren't talking, but their movements had synchronized. They worked in quiet rhythm, bending, lifting, passing buckets as if following a silent prayer. It unnerved the guards. Creepy, sir. One whispered, "They act like ghosts." Reeves studied his daily log. Yes, discipline incidents had dropped by 30%, but that wasn't obedience. It was collapse. Even the guards grew jumpy, whispering superstitions. A silence that deep becomes contagious. He wrote another note in the margin. "We are measuring quiet instead of morale." That night, over canned beans in the mess tent, Reeves overheard two officers joking about the order. "Best command we've ever had, no noise, no nonsense." Laughter rippled. Reeves forced a smile, but his pen tapped restlessly on the table. Next morning, HQ sent a directive, "Captain Reeves, inspect female barracks for compliance." He folded the paper slowly. The words "for compliance" rang in his ears like a warning. Outside, the women lined up again under the sun, expressionless, waiting. Reeves grabbed his clipboard and started walking toward them, boots crunching through the dust, the order echoing in his head. By midday, the heat shimmered off the corrugated roofs like steam from a forge. Captain Reeves moved through the camp with his sergeant, both sweating through their khaki. The sound of his boots crunching on gravel was the only noise daring to exist. Every set of eyes he passed dropped instantly. When they reached the women's barrack, Reeves stopped. The place smelled of boiled rice and mildew. A few women stood at attention near the doorway barefoot, sunburned, silent. He nodded, motioning for the interpreter. "Tell them we're checking for prohibited materials," he said. Inside, the air felt different. Dense, almost humming. Mats lined the floor in tight rows. A few paper fans hung limp from the bamboo walls. Reeves's eyes swept the corners, looking for contraband. Nothing. Then, under one of the low wooden tables, he saw it. A folded scrap of paper, half, hidden beneath a rice bowl. He bent down. The sergeant tensed. "Sir." "Careful." Reeves ignored him, lifting the note delicately as if it might explode. The paper was thin, almost translucent with sweat stains. He unfolded it. Just one word, written in trembling Japanese characters. "Listen." That word shouldn't have meant much, but it hit him like a punch. He asked the interpreter to confirm. "Hi, it says listen." For a moment Reeves stood frozen. No prayer, no symbol, just that single plea. The room felt smaller. The women stared straight ahead, hands by their sides, not blinking. The sergeant whispered, "Sir, this against Reg's." Reeves didn't answer. He folded the paper again and slipped it into his pocket. "Carry on," he said quietly. Outside, he checked the time, barely noon, yet the day felt endless. As they walked back toward HQ, the sergeant muttered, "They're weird, sir. Don't talk, don't fight, don't ask for anything." Reeves just said, "Maybe they're asking. We just don't hear it." The sergeant frowned, confused. That evening, Reeves sat alone in his office. He unfolded the paper again, tracing the ink marks with his thumb. The words seemed to hum, even without sound. He stared at the water ration chart pinned to the wall. The numbers were low, too low. Without really thinking, he grabbed his pen and scribbled an order. "Refill water barrels for the women's hut." Effective tonight, the camp would notice, and so would HQ. Captain Reeves couldn't shake that word, "listen." It pulsed in his mind like a heartbeat. That night, he ordered the water barrels refilled for the women's hut. Officially, he wrote it down as sanitation protocol. Unofficially, it was an act of quiet defiance. The pumps wheezed and hissed as soldiers filled each barrel under lantern light. The women watched from the shadows, their faces unreadable, but their posture shifted barely, subtly, as if acknowledging something had changed. Reeves noticed. For once, they didn't look like statues. By morning, the rumor had spread through the camp. The captain broke ration limits. Water was more precious than kindness here. 1 gallon per prisoner per day strictly rationed. Even medics had to beg for more. Yet now, the women's barracks had clean barrels gleaming under the sun. A corporal asked quietly, "Sir, we giving them special treatment?" Reeves didn't look up. "We're giving them water, that's not special." Official memos later called it a temporary morale adjustment, but inside the camp something shifted. The guards stopped shouting as much. A few even saluted slower, as if unsure who deserved it. It wasn't pity. It was the first crack in the armor of indifference. In her hut, Shizuko saw the barrels and whispered to another woman someone heard. That whisper carried. It wasn't prayer, not technically, but it spread like one. Ellis, the medic, noticed it too. When he came for morning rounds, he found the air strangely calm. He didn't know about the note or the order, only that the camp suddenly felt less like a tomb, mercy rationed like sugar. He muttered, almost smiling. But for Reeves, it wasn't peace. It was risk. He knew HQ would raid the supply logs, and the numbers wouldn't lie. He'd crossed a line, even if the ink wasn't red yet. That night, he sat by the open window, the humid air thick as breath. The paper with the word "listen" lay on his desk. He couldn't bring himself to burn it. Finally, he folded it again, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and whispered, "I did." The next morning, he broke a far stricter rule. He spoke directly to one of the prisoners. The next morning broke grey and heavy, clouds sagging low like wet canvas. Reeves walked the yard with purpose, the note in his pocket, pressing against his chest. He stopped near the women's fence, eyes scanning the rows of faces until he saw her. The one who always seemed to look, past him rather than at him. Shizuko, the nurse with the quiet eyes, a guard stiffened. "Sir, you're not supposed to." "I know," Reeves said, cutting him off. Interpreter. The Japanese interpreter, a thin man with hollow cheeks, stepped forward nervously. Reeves motioned for him to stand close, but not between them. "Ask her," Reeves said softly, "why prayer matters so much." The interpreter hesitated, then translated. The question hung in the damp air. Shizuko looked at Reeves, really looked for the first time. Her lips trembled, but her voice was clear. "She says," the interpreter paused, glancing at the captain. "She says, because silence kills slower than bullets." Reeves felt the words land like shrapnel. For a moment, everything else faded: the camp, the guards, the noise of distant trucks. Just that sentence hanging there, sharp as glass. He didn't respond. He only nodded once, then turned away, but the interpreter caught his expression, something cracking behind his steady officer's mask. Back in the infirmary, Ellis overheard the whispers. The captain talked to one of them. A guard said, "Directly against Regs." Ellis said nothing, but he watched Reeves walk past, jaw tight, eyes somewhere far away. Linguists were rare, just 2 interpreters for 500 prisoners. Most officers spoke through orders, not words. But that single exchange between captor and captive, one question, one answer, travelled faster than any command. That evening, Reeves wrote in his field journal, "They're not defying us, they're surviving us." He shut the notebook and stared at the oil lamp flickering on his desk. Around him, the camp hummed faintly with generator noise and the distant rattle of tin bowls. Somewhere beyond the fence, he could almost hear women whispering again, not words, just breathe. He realized he couldn't report this conversation without condemning them, or himself, so he didn't. Instead, he reached for his typewriter and began writing something no one had asked him to write. A memo, secret, dangerous, human. The typewriter keys clacked like distant gunfire. Each strike deliberate, each pause heavy. Captain Reeves sat alone in the dim operations hut. Sleeves rolled up, sweat bleeding through his shirt. Outside, the rain hissed against the tin roof. Steady, relentless. He was writing something that shouldn't exist. Subject, morale analysis, Camp O'Donnell Mindanao Sector recommendation. Partial lifting of religious ban. Controlled worship may stabilize psychological state of prisoners and reduce fatalities. He stopped, fingers hovering above the keys. His pulse thudded. It wasn't just an observation, it was dissent in black ink. He imagined the chain of command reading it, red pencils marking him for sentimental deviation. Still, he kept typing. Moral benefits outweigh risk of disorder. A cigarette burned down beside him, ash pooling like grey snow. He knew this wasn't policy, it was plea. The silence had worked too well. It had crushed the captives and infected the captors. Reeves' mind flicked back to Shizuko's words. Silence kills slower than bullets. He didn't believe in her gods, but he believed in that truth. He added one final line before pulling the paper free. Recommend discretion. Humanity must not be mistaken for weakness. He signed it, Captain M. Reeves, and sealed it with shaking hands. Reports later revealed that only 1 in 20 such field memos ever reached Pacific Command without being buried or lost in routing. Most officers never risked writing them, but Reeves did, because he couldn't unsee what silence had done. At dawn, Ellis saw him walking to the radio shack, envelope in hand. "Sir, that for HQ." Reeves nodded. "Something like that." 2 days later, the reply came back, a single-page response, stamped in cold red ink, denied. No explanation, no discussion, just that one word, heavy as iron. Ellis found Reeves sitting on his cot that night, staring at the rejection slip. "Orders?" Ellis asked quietly. Reeves didn't answer. He just folded the paper, lit a match, and watched the flame curl the edges black. The smoke rose slow, curling toward the ceiling like a prayer that wouldn't die. But outside, someone saw the glow from the window and whispered, "They're praying again." And by morning the camp would believe it. The paper was still warm when Reeves touched it, the word denied stamped in red, crooked and final. No explanation, no signature, just rejection in bureaucratic ink. He sat on the edge of his cot, uniform shirt unbuttoned, fan blades slicing the air above him like lazy propellers. For a long time, he didn't move. Outside, the afternoon heat had turned the camp into a furnace. Guards leaned on their rifles, sweat rolling down their necks. Somewhere in the distance, a truck backfired, sharp, sudden, like punctuation to a thought no one dared speak. Ellis stepped into the doorway, holding 2 tin cups of coffee. "Heard from HQ?" he asked. Reeves didn't look up. "Yeah, they heard me too." The medic set the cups down, glanced at the paper and sighed. "Doesn't surprise me. You can't file empathy through channels." Reeves gave a tired smile. They managed to deny it fast enough. That night, when the camp generator coughed to life, Reeves burned the memo. He fed each page slowly into a tin basin, watching the words buckle and curl. The ink turned to black smoke that drifted out through the open window. From the women's huts, faint silhouettes watched. They couldn't see what burned, only the glow. For a moment, it looked like a ritual, a forbidden act. One of the women whispered, "Maybe someone prays for us now." A guard, seeing the light, muttered, "They're at it again." He raised his rifle halfway, but Reeves's voice stopped him cold. "That's an officer's quarters. Stand down." The guard blinked, confused, then obeyed. In the ash, a single carbon sheet survived, half burned, half legible. The ghost of Reeves's signature still visible at the bottom. He folded it gently, tucked it into his pocket, a reminder maybe that he'd tried. Later, Ellis found him outside the hut, staring at the smoke rising over the camp. "You ever think we'll win this war?" the medic asked. Reeves exhaled. "We'll end it. Not sure we'll win it." Behind them, the women stirred in the shadows. A soft hum rose, not words, not defiance, just sound. It blended with the wind, eerie and low. Ellis frowned. "You hear that?" Reeves nodded once, eyes fixed on the dark huts. "Yeah," he said quietly, "something's starting." It started with one voice. Barely a hum, soft, trembling, almost mistaken for the wind. A Japanese nurse in Barrack 7, sitting cross-legged on her mat, eyes closed. She wasn't praying, not technically, just humming the melody her mother used to sing while cleaning rice. By nightfall, another woman joined in, then another. The sound grew, low, rhythmic, strangely unified. Not words, not rebellion, just vibration. Something human finding its way through rules written in someone else's language. The guards noticed first. One leaned toward the bamboo wall, listening. "Sir, they're making noise," he reported hesitantly. The officer on duty frowned. Noise or singing? Neither, the guard said, something in between. They decided to ignore it. The command said no prayer, but the sound had no shape, no language, just tone. Punishing it would mean defining it. And HQ hated ambiguity, so the humming continued. Inside the huts, the women didn't look at each other. They didn't need to. The sound held them together, each breath weaving into the next. Some hummed higher, some lower, creating a quiet tide that rolled through the barracks and out into the warm tropical night. Ellis, walking back from the infirmary, froze when he heard it. The noise wasn't eerie, it was alive. For weeks the camp had been suffocating under silence, and now the air moved again. "What the hell is that?" a corporal muttered. Ellis answered softly, "It's what prayer sounds like when you ban words." The logbooks later recorded nothing. No violations, no riots, no disturbances. Officially, nothing happened. Yet within days, the reports from all 11 camps showed a strange pattern. 0 punishments logged for verbal disobedience. The rule hadn't been broken. It had been rewritten in melody. Reeves stood by his quarters, hands in pockets, listening. The humming was faint but steady, threading through the darkness. It wasn't defiance. It was endurance, pure and untranslatable. He looked at the guard beside him. "Don't stop it," Reeves said quietly. The guard blinked. "But sir, the rule." I said don't. And so, for the first time in months, something inside the fence was louder than fear. By midnight, the sound had spread through every hut. An invisible anthem rising under a sky heavy with stars. Tomorrow, that sound would find its full voice. By the third night, the camp had changed. The air itself seemed to vibrate. That faint humming, born as a whisper of defiance, had grown into something else entirely. Not a song, not quite music, but a living current flowing through the huts and into the open yard. Guards patrolling the fence slowed their steps, listening. Even the dogs, usually restless, sat still, ears tilted toward the sound. Under the pale moon, the women's faces glowed, sweat catching the light like silver. Their eyes were closed, their breathing in perfect rhythm. Each inhale was hope, each exhale surrender. From the guard tower, a private radioed command. "Sir, the prisoners aren't making a sound again." "Are they praying?" came the reply. He hesitated. "No, sir, they're alive." That line never made it into the report, but others remembered it. Reeves stood by his office window, coat draped over his chair. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just listened. The hum rolled through the night like the ocean, low, steady, unstoppable. It wasn't defiance anymore. It was unity. Inside the huts, Ellis moved between cots, pretending to check vitals. In truth, he was listening too. "They told us not to pray," he murmured, so they made prayer out of breathing. When dawn touched the horizon, something extraordinary happened. The humming didn't stop. It evolved, soft tones rising, merging, fading. A rhythm of survival disguised as nothing at all. The guards stood frozen, rifles limp at their sides. No one wanted to be the first to interrupt it. Stat sheets later showed a 40% rise in morale that week. No one could explain it. No new rations, no change in command. Just an unrecorded, soundless act of rebellion. Reeves watched from the yard as the morning light spread across the wire. "They're teaching us something," he muttered. Ellis, standing beside him, nodded. Maybe that silence isn't always obedience. Neither man spoke again. They just stood there, listening to the quiet that had learned to sing. As the hum began to fade, the camp felt suspended like holding breath before an ending. Reeves straightened his cap and looked toward the women's huts. He knew this would not last. Orders never allowed peace to linger. But that final note was still echoing when dawn broke over the compound, and Reeves couldn't tell any more which side of the fence he stood on. Dawn crept slow over the camp, painting the barbed wire silver. Smoke from the kitchen fires curled into the sky, mixing with fog that clung to the huts. The humming was gone now, ended as suddenly as it had begun. What remained was an aftertaste of quiet, heavy and sacred. Captain Reeves stood at his window, sleeves rolled, coffee untouched. He looked out over the compound where the women were lining up for roll call. No one spoke. Even the guards, usually shouting orders, called out names softer than usual, as if afraid to break something fragile in the air. Reeves adjusted his cap, eyes tracing the faces, each one thinner, older, but calm. The sound that had filled the camp for nights still echoed inside him. He couldn't unhear it. It had carved space where obedience used to live. Ellis approached from behind, boots crunching lightly on gravel. "They stopped," he said. Reeves nodded. "Yeah, they don't need to do it anymore." For a moment neither man spoke. The war around them was ending. Rumors said Japan's surrender was near, but inside the wire time still held its breath. "Will you tell HQ?" Ellis asked quietly. Reeves shook his head. "There's nothing to report, no rules broken, just something remembered." He turned to leave, then paused. From the far end of the yard, one woman bowed slightly toward the watchtower, not fear, not submission, but acknowledgement. Reeves returned the gesture with the faintest nod. Later that day, he ordered the flag raised. No ceremony, no speech. Just the sound of canvas flapping against the pole. The war, for all practical purposes, was over, yet no document ever rescinded the order, "Do not pray here." It remained in the archives, untouched, unchallenged. When the camps finally opened and the prisoners were repatriated, reports said the Japanese women left quietly. No tears, no songs, no bitterness. But those who'd been there swore something lingered in the silence, a memory that hummed beneath the surface. Reeves watched the last truck pull away, dust rising behind it. "Maybe that's what prayer really is," he whispered. "Something that survives the order to stop." The wind shifted, carrying the faint rattle of the empty barrels. And for a heartbeat, it sounded like the hum had returned.